Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of July. We really do have an abundance of Russian advances to cover, some of which unfolded today and others are the culmination of a lot of information coming out over the past week and then finally today being confirmed. We're going to begin by looking at the region east of Vuhledar, then Krasnohorivka, the Pokrovsk Direction. Some interesting gains around the cities of New York and Toretsk, and then finally ending with Makiivka on the Luhansk front. Starting off with the region that I would refer to as a broader part of the Konstantinivka or southern Donetsk front, we had information coming out from Ukrainian sources of a Russian advance that amounted to something in the ballpark of 5 square kilometers just to the northeast of Makiivka and a 1 kilometer advance westwards. So here's just an outline of where the Russians were able to advance through. This comes following really a week where the Russian forces really did speed up the pace of advances in this gray zone region between the Russian line of contact in the broader southern Donetsk region. If we zoom out and we see that a lot of the Russian defenses here that were built over the past year and a half are centered around the rail line that stretches out from Vuhledar to the south and then connects to the city of Donetsk. And so that's generally where the Russian hubs in this region have been located, their forward operating bases. And since then, they've expanded westwards first into Makiivka, and that left a large gap with the fields that are in between Makiivka and Makiivka, because holding positions there is something that is up for debate whether it's really advantageous, because on the one hand you have the fact that a lot of these regions that the Russians are now capturing from the Ukrainians are on rather large heights. You could see that with the second square that I drew. This is an area that the Russians recently took over the past couple of days, and it is located on a hill that is largely overlooking the positions on which the Russians were operating with their units from the 36th Brigade in Makiivka over here, which is essentially bisected by a river, and so it's on a river valley and it's on rather low elevation. And then you also have Vuhledar and the coal mine, and so generally the Ukrainians do have a lot of higher elevated regions here. But nonetheless, you have the problem that a lot of these fields that the Ukrainians are trying to maintain control over as sort of buffer for the road connecting between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka are really just disconnected from the main Ukrainian defensive organs in the region. And they're not as well connected by logistics that could readily reach the front line here because of how protruding the sort of front line is in this region. And it really is dangerous to traverse open fields to reach those particular areas without any sort of organized settlement where you could have a small group congregate in or any sort of larger formation then split up. And so that's definitely a concern with holding these regions. And that really became apparent as time went on when the Russian forces just continued increasing pressure, utilizing armored assaults, motorcycles, infantry advancing on foot, and then gradually pushing through, albeit with the Ukrainians through every single kilometer trying to push back the Russians or target them with their aerial units. We talked about this in the last video as well, so we're not going to get too deep into it. But just so you guys know, the Russian forces within the past week, they started making efforts not just directly south of Makiivka, but also east of Makiivka over here. And that's something that we hadn't seen in over a year. So the Russians controlled this region over here. They were able to take it over from the Skala battalion in fighting this month. And using control over those new positions, they were able to put pressure on whatever Ukrainian squads remained in these fields over here and sort of squeezed out the Ukrainian salient. And that's really manifested itself in today's update, where we see that now the front line has sort of stabilized as the Russian forces are now, if you measure it, about 3.5 kilometers away from the 00532 road, an important highway that connects between two of Ukraine's most important frontline villages, Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. And of course, it is hard to use this road, but you do sometimes need to use frontline paths to move forces around, especially when you look at the logistics here. They really are poor. They were poor before the war, and since then they become even worse as the Russians are constantly bombarding them, because you don't really have any sort of intermediate path to connect between the various chains of villages that Ukraine has in the southern Donetsk area. For instance, between this line over here that I marked and then this line going to the southeast, You don't really have any roads in between that are connecting between them. You only have this one. And so if they lose this one, they have to make these massive loops or rely on the rather unreliable open fields. Looking at Krasnohorivka, the Russians again have just slightly advanced in the western, southwestern portions of the city or town. And these are areas where you do have very small Ukrainian holdouts just trying to drag out the fighting as long as possible to prevent the Russian infantry here from diverting attention further north. And so you just have these continued Russian combing operations of the warehouse regions and just a few more residential houses. But then looking further north, this is where we did have actually a very interesting advance. And so the Russians, in their fullest extent, were able to take another 220 meters of land, advancing again through the private residential areas. This is where the Ukrainians are trying to drag out the fight now because they don't really have any other choice. You have air assault units primarily, but also territorial defense units working with drone crews, trying to just slow down the Russians as long as possible. That can be seen here in this video from July 3rd of one of those drone groups essentially dropping grenades onto a grouping of 4 Russian soldiers in the nearby houses, and they're able to avoid the grenades. And that should show you just an idea of how the Ukrainians are defending here. And so the Russian forces, they're only, if we measure it now, about 500, 600 meters away from this very important horizontal road, which connects Krasnohorivka to its wider suburbs to the west, which are the safer, I guess you could say, organizing points for the Ukrainian defense in Krasnohorivka. I guess a lot of platoons or companies that are then sent to Krasnohorivka and split up into smaller formations, they first have to cross through this area, and it's where some of their paths start. So, for instance, they come from across the Vovcha River, and then they have to first congregate here because there's no other place east of the Vovcha River, which is located over here. There's no other organized settlement for the Ukrainians to go to besides the western suburbs of Krasnohorivka. And so, by necessity, they have to go there. And now the Russian forces are very close to cutting off that particular road leading into the heart of the town. And then there's another one that's a bit further north, Krupskoy Street, which the Russians are also advancing in the direction of. And so it does raise a threat as to whether the Ukrainians could maintain control over this easternmost parts of the city in an area where you do have a few more fortresses that the Ukrainians control, some defenses, but it's mainly the hospital area and some high rises. But in terms of the heaviest fighting in apartment buildings and factories, a lot of that has already occurred because the Russian forces were involved in the arduous process of advancing past that point. And in some cases, they were able to evade some of the heaviest fighting when taking over certain factories. But then again, the fighting is now getting dragged out in the residential areas, which are more open. And so it's a double-edged sword because the Russians are also able to fire artillery towards those areas. And then you have both sides, drone crews trying to spot any sort of infantry in the open and target them. But yeah, the Russian forces really are closing in on this western direction on the town, and that is a big threat to any forces to the east. Now, we really don't get a break when it comes to the Pokrovsk direction. Every single day, we're basically getting updates from here. And as I always stress, it's a common theme relating to the rail line that comes out of Cheratina. And that's just such a big part of why the effects of the Russian capture of that town still reverberates to this day. And I just can't stress that enough. The fact that the Russian forces do have this paved road just parallel essentially to the entire path of this particular rail line, and that the embankment itself in the fields north and south of it that the Russians are under control of are on the dominant heights in the region. It's just so significant for the Russian advance and aids them so much in their efforts at continuing to advance westwards. And that momentum has pushed forward into today, where we do have information regarding a Russian advance, which really, I guess you could say just a 1 kilometer advance, and the Russian forces were able to take 1.35 square kilometers. I'm just going to try and draw out the region that they were able to take this time around off the top of my head and see if it comes out pretty accurately. Yeah, something in this ballpark. And then you could see that the Russians were able to advance about 1 kilometer along that same road because either they're using troops that are walking through the windbreaks or they are trying to get an MTLB and then dismount the forces in those same areas. And the Russians are now getting really close to the village of Luzovatske, which is in a very compromised position because, first of all, the Russian forces are in control of Novo-Oleksandrivka to the northeast, and they have control of the heights directly to the east of it that are facing towards the village. And those include fortified areas and they include, again, hills. Meanwhile, you have essentially this lower lying tributary that sort of extends to the southeast through the village. And so it's located on a valley in relation to the Russian positions. And then, of course, you have the actual rail embankment itself, which is overlooking the village from the southeast. And so basically, when you look forward, you're facing a Russian opposition that does have a height advantage. And this is in the immediate level. So you would have really, if you're standing in this battlefield, engaging in the fights, then it would have a direct impact that could be sensed by the soldiers there. And you could also see how this village is sort of disconnected from the other contingents of Ukrainian forces in this region. So, for instance, you have this general line that is formed from Baranivka, then going further south to Timofivka. And a lot of these villages are just sort of unified by the Toretsk River. They may not be on the strongest positions, but at least they are generally connected. There's a sort of I guess you could say thread that's connecting them together. And then you have this one village that's just protruding and becomes more exposed as a result from the fields nearby that could be used as flanking. And so, yeah, just that's a weak link for the Ukrainians here. And losing control of that village, which is something that the Ukrainians have to take into account, given that the Ukrainians don't really have defenses built over here, could put the Ukrainian groupings around the Toretsk River in future threats. Something that hasn't been talked about yet, but definitely will become a topic of conversation in the coming weeks, is the Ukrainian grouping here and how they're going to respond to this coming threats, which is really only occurring because the Russians do have that advantage along the rail embankment. But looking a bit further south, we see that the Russian advance is directly facing towards the village of Pokrovsk. And this is a rather small village. It's also connected to Volche, which is another hamlet, you could say. And that advance, first of all, directly threatens whatever's left of Ukrainian holdings in Voskod, Yevanivka, or any other trenches or fields east of the Vavcha River here. And then it also really represents an equal threat to the villages that are located on the Vavcha River and even to the west of it. And the big threat for the Ukrainians here, which I've been stressing since the Russians intensified attacks here in the past few weeks, entering the Sokil, is the fact that if they're able to pass the Vavcha River here in an area that is relatively narrow, you can't even see it really in the map. It's very shallow, very narrow. It isn't even something that the Russians are taking into account. Like, they don't have to bring in pontoons or anything of the sorts. If they can use Pokrovsk as a sort of bridge across the river, and then that would undermine the entire integrity of the line that the Ukrainians have been trying to build over this long period of time since the fall of Avdiivka. And you'd have the southern vector to begin harassing various strong points that are located on hills that the Ukrainians are setting up. And that's something that definitely the Ukrainians have to attend to, whether it be really speeding up the process of building defenses here, or redirecting certain units, or really sort of reorganizing units and putting them together into a certain spot to fill in any gaps around here. There definitely has to be some sort of action taken to stabilize the line over here, because the Russian momentum is, of course, going to be exploited if they don't see any sort of strong Ukrainian resistance here. I do know there is strong Ukrainian resistance in Voskod, in Sokil, and that direct resistance has prevented Russian advance at a faster pace, but I haven't seen as much of that along the rail line just to the north. There may be some presence of the 110th Brigade, but we just haven't seen enough of it. Now, moving on to the Toretsk axis, I don't want to separate the cities of Toretsk and, I guess you could say, town of New York, because they really are inseparable. You have to look at them as a single body when examining the reasons why the Russians are attacking here. And so first I'm going to start by posing the question, are the Ukrainian units that are located here sufficient in holding the line? And I was posing this question first about 2 weeks ago when the Russians first started probing along the Sumy area and made their first advances. They were able to sense that there was a Ukrainian gap, that they were not properly manned in the trenches that were built over there. And as a result, they were able to secure this forward operating base in Sumy and expand westwards from there, as we're going to see today. Now, the Russians have also sensed a certain gap in an area that really shouldn't be it shouldn't be exposed because it is a populated area and it is protecting the southern flank of such an important Ukrainian frontline garrison such as New York. And so you shouldn't be seeing that in an area like this. So the fact that you see the Russian forces being able to exploit the front line in an area that has been on at the line of contact for 10 years now, because even during the Civil War, this was generally the same sort of front line composition. The fact that now we're seeing that radically change in the course of a few days or weeks is really concerning, and it does pose questions as to whether the manpower here is enough to prevent future Russian advances that would be able to completely undermine a defense of a city like Toretsk. Because when I look at this unit composition, what I see is perhaps this National Guard brigade, which really doesn't have that much experience, and I don't know if they're also committed further westwards to the, post Avdiivka area. You have the 109th Territorial Defense Brigade located over here. I don't even know if they're fully committed to the Toretsk axis, but let's say they are for the sake of argument. You have perhaps the 46th Rifle Battalion, an independent battalion, which hasn't been really chronicled to be fighting here for over a year, so we don't know its whereabouts. And then you have the 78th Hertz Regiment, an independent air assault unit, which has more experience in offensive operations during the counteroffensive, less so with this sort of like urban environment sort of warfare. But still, it is a more modern trained unit, you could say. And then you have the 28th Mechanized Brigade. This unit was fighting around Chasiv Yar, specifically in an area just south of generally the Bakhmut region. So they were involved in Andriivka, Kordyumivka, Klishivka. And so the reason why it was moved in is just due to its proximity to the Toretsk axis. The Ukrainians desperately needed a unit to reinforce their line. And so they didn't care that really the Chasiv Yar area is very important in that moving a unit away from there would embolden the Russians. But they just had to desperately fill in these holes. They couldn't wait another day or another week to move in a whole another unit. And so they just sent this one a couple of kilometers south to hold this region just to the east of Druzhba. And so that's the entire Ukrainian defensive component here. And we talked about a 20-kilometer front line that starts in the pumping station of the Donbass Canal over here and then ends all the way in Alexandropol to the southwest. That's a massive part of the front line, and it's really just surprising to see that the Ukrainians lacked any sort of depth in terms of their manpower here. But I'll say the reason why is because the Ukrainians really needed those units elsewhere, and they were just banking on the fact that the Russians wouldn't attack here. And that is a gamble that now they're paying the consequences for, because now they're forced to inevitably move in units from other key parts of the front line to hold over here. And then that's inevitably going to lead to degradations in those respective parts of the front line. And so if we're beginning to look, for instance, at an area like Yurivka, this is where I'll start. The Russian forces were able to capture an area that is nearly 5 square kilometers. They were able to advance directly through a chain of houses going to the north and walking along the windbreaks of a rail line. They were able to nearly advance 4 kilometers, and they were able to capture nearly the entirety of the Yurivka hamlet. And so they're advancing along the Toretsk River here, low-lying region, and they're only about 1 kilometer, I'd say, from New York itself, the outskirts of New York. And there aren't even that many well-built defenses at its approaches. And so the Russians are really already at the entrance and are very close to reaching the heart of New York. And they've done this without even having to fight over the eastern defenses that were built over here over such a long period of time for that exact reason. And then that poses a question about whether the Ukrainians can even maintain control over a salient like this for any long period of time, especially once the Russians consolidate their gains here. So they're going to have to eventually give up control over such key trenches. That's something that would also really be a waste after all the resources put into them. Same thing for this salient over here, you could say. Now, why would the Russians even be able to advance here? The reason why is because I talked about this in a few earlier videos, but generally the Russian forces, they shaped the battlefield here slightly. First by conducting these FAB strikes and TOS-1A strikes on Alexandropol, and that was able to degrade the Ukrainian frontline force here. And so there's a question as to whether there even is a strong Ukrainian garrison there anymore because of how disconnected it is from the nearby regions. And so then if the Russians a couple of kilometers eastwards want to start advancing, then it's going to be easier because they don't have to worry about that western flank harassing them. At the same time, the Russian forces were able to neuter some of Ukraine's elevation advantage, which I'm going to explain right now. The elevation advantage that Ukraine has is that there's essentially this horseshoe of hills that the Ukrainians largely control that overlooks the Russian vector of advance along the Toretsk River towards New York over here. And you could see that horseshoe that I drew over here. It's a U shape that essentially is starting along the highway over here that you see marked, and then go south along the H20 highway itself, then sort of loops around Alexander Peel and then goes further north and reaches the western entrance into New York. That U shape is just a really important height that the Ukrainians maintain control over. And in theory, it should be enough for the Ukrainians to repel any sort of Russian effort through a low-lying valley just to the east. But that's why the Russian forces were involved in getting control over at least a certain portion of that horseshoe in recent months, taking over gradually some fields near Alexander Peel, taking over some forested areas, small dugouts, and then, of course, just obliterating any sort of Ukrainian position located on those nearby hills, whether it be to the west or even some hills that are located even further west around here, for instance. And so, yeah, that definitely played a role in opening the pathway for the Russians to advance around here. And we just talked about the consequences, but we could talk about the implications more as the Russians are now only about, I guess you could say, 2 kilometers away from one of the major Ukrainian lines of defense that was built over here, built past New York, west of New York, built even past of Toretsk as a sort of final fallback line in this general sector. And even those lines are now being reached by the Russians. And that's not to say that they're going to be able to break through them anytime soon, but at least having a foothold nearby puts constant pressure and makes it difficult to further build them up. And now this is where the situation gets even more interesting because we have confirmation from the Ukrainian and Russian side alike. Like I saw this in Deep State Petrenko, but we don't even need the Ukrainian sources to verify what occurred around here because we have geolocated footage that was released today, actually from the Ukrainian side, July 3rd. It showed 2 Ukrainian airstrikes on the Pivnishnya apartment complex that I was talking about in one of my earlier videos, maybe 2-3 videos ago. And so I'll just fill you guys in if you're not aware of what occurred around here. We know that the Russians have control over Sumy and they were able to establish this sort of foothold within the easternmost areas of the suburb Zalizhnya, which is over here if you guys see. And so the Russians had control of this sort of front line, you could say, if we're being pretty vague with the front lines. And then from there, what really popped out to me is that the Russians were just able to continue pouncing. The Ukrainians were not able to organize a strong defensive line anywhere here. They just couldn't stop the Russian momentum. They were just completely overwhelmed, including the new reinforcements that came in to hold the line. And so the Russian forces just pushed westwards, occupied all of this forested region, and all of that forested region is still just concealed because there hasn't been much shelling over there. This region has not seen high-intensity combat throughout most of the war. And so most of these structures are still intact, including the apartments we're going to get to. And so the Russian forces, coupled with their advance directly through the Zalizhnya district, were able to attack from the south and west and were able to infiltrate into this very important apartment complex. This apartment complex is important because when you look at the heights in the Toretsk suburbs, Toretsk, if we zoom out, is over here, and its suburbs include Druzhba, Pivnishnya, and Zalizhnya. The Russian vector of advance has generally been around the heights. The heights that in this region, they extend from the east over here where Horivka is located. You can't see it on the map, but they extend to here, this field north of Sumy. Then they go through this sort of field region over here. And then they include the entire district that the Russians already occupied over here. And then they sort of end around the apartment complex and some of the nearby houses. The final sort of major height that you have in the region is this massive slag heap, which the Ukrainians, luckily for them, still do maintain control over. But one of the final heights in this region and one of the final vantage points is this apartment complex. And the fact that the Russians were able to reach it so quickly after I said that the Ukrainians had to make a strong effort of holding on to it really does show how unprepared they were and how they could not have mounted a successful defense in this region. So now it's really a question of whether the Russians could capitalize on their very fast advances here, because if we're looking at the extent, of course, has been rather large. I'll measure it with the stick over here for you guys so you could get a good idea of what land they were actually able to capture this time around. And the fact that they were able to capture this 1.35 square kilometers and then also advance directly, I guess you could say 1.3 kilometers to the northwest through an area that is relatively dense. We're reaching suburbs of a city, reaching a major apartment complex that the Ukrainians could be using as an observation and firing point. The fact that they did that and that you don't even see any destruction in its midst really is crazy. And that's why the Ukrainians have to now try to destroy the apartment complex. Because if they're not going to be able to use it to their advantage, then they can't let the Russians be able to use it. Because the Russians, they have control of the nearby heights. But of course, having immediate control over a fortified structure like an apartment complex overlooking an entire suburb would be very dangerous for any sort of Ukrainian defenders that are trying to hold on to the lower lying parts of the suburb, trying to defend the private residential areas that I'm marking with an X over here. And that apartment complex would sort of serve as a forward hub for Russia to fire towards those regions in all directions, essentially. And so now the Ukrainians are trying to actually destroy those apartment buildings, destroy the Russians within it, of course. We see this with these Ukrainian airstrikes directed towards that region. And that's for the goal of at least trying to take away that advantage from the Russians. Now, in terms of what Ukraine can do, I can't speak to the logistics or anything like that. But I do know that just from looking at the map, it is extremely important that they maintain control over this yellow line that you see marked over here that spans from this slag heap to this slag heap further south. These are the two final vantage points the Ukrainians have at the line of contact. If you want to be super technical about it and look further west, there are also other heights that the Ukrainians have under their control, but those are already pretty deep into Toretsk, and the Ukrainians really do not want to have an urban battle dragging out within a city like that. That's the entire point of building defenses east of that particular city. But now a lot of them have been overwhelmed. But you do have this one last line over here marked in yellow that should be based on paper, at least, should be well defendable. But when you look at the actual manpower the Ukrainians have at the moment, it's not sufficient. But they do have two very important heights to maintain control over, and then they have this road that's connecting them together, and then you have nearby forests. And the final thing about the sector is that now we have an idea of which Russian units are actually conducting the attacks. So you have the DPR's 1st Army Corps, the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade, previously operated around the Avdiivka region. It's not a particularly, I guess you could say, high brass, top brass sort of unit. So the fact that even they were able to do it really does lend credence to my previous points. But then you also have involvement from the 60th Motorized Battalion, which is also named the Veterans PMC, made of a lot of former Wagner mercenaries. And some people refer to it as a battalion, others say it's a brigade. And so I'm not sure about its exact size, whether it's just 1,000 people or a couple thousand people. I'm not exactly sure about the actual size. But they're also involved in the sabotage operations and some of the, I guess you could say, more kinetic actions, some of the more unconventional attacks. And then, of course, they're conducting some of these vanguard attacks through urban areas, which they have a lot of experience with in Bakhmut, which does have a lot of similarities when you look, for instance, at the apartment buildings over here, but then a lot of differences when it comes to the sort of manpower differences, because the Ukrainians had so many brigades committed to Bakhmut, for instance, versus this area. So in a way, this actually benefits the Russian defenders over here, of course. And then looking one last time at this part of the front line, we have a geolocated video which shows over here this 28th Mechanized Brigade dropping a landmine on a house which the Russians occupied in northeastern Druzhba. And of course, we know that they're capable of dropping these high explosive mines on Russian positions. What's interesting is the fact that the Russians were able to, again, break through the line over here, break past the trenches that were set up near the Donbass Canal. And then if we look at the extent of their advance, the Russians were able to gain 1.5 kilometers going to the northwest. Some of this was done through the momentum from the rail line itself, which the Russians advanced through over this past week. the soldiers were able to dismount within the actual residential areas in eastern Druzhba, and now they're also doing it in the northeastern direction, as was confirmed by the Ukrainian drone video. And lastly, now we have the basically admittal that the Ukrainians have fully lost the canal district of Chasiv Yar. This was reported on by Deep State, and then also the Russian sources relayed that same fact. And so it's not really on dispute right now. I guess the only thing that's disputed is what's going on in this forested region between Kalinina and Canal District, because there isn't really any sort of geolocated proof from this region, but it would just not make sense for the Ukrainians to maintain any sort of permanent position there. So for now, I'm putting it in the gray zone. Interestingly enough, this is also the lowest lying region across the entire battlefield right now when you compare it to what the Ukrainians and Russians control. And so now with the capture of the Canal District, which in my last video I said maybe the Ukrainians are still here, we have to be cautious before making a conclusive statement. So I still had the Ukrainians marked in this general region. As a result of this capture announcement, it means that the Russian forces are in full control over the factory in the region, in full control over the apartments. But there is actually some satellite imagery that Deep State released, which shows how so many of these apartment buildings are just completely destroyed. Some of them not totally, and could be basically utilized as vantage points, but others have been at least partially damaged, and a lot of them have just lost a lot of their structure, a lot of ruins nearby. And so it does decrease the effectiveness of using them as firing points and as observation posts, but it could still be used. And that's something that the Canal District gives the Russians. Even without the apartments are an added bonus. Just stepping foot on this district does give the Russians a elevation parity with much of the Ukrainian positions located in Chasiv Yar, whether it be the eastern district over here or the heart of Chasiv Yar itself. And so that's something that the Russians really are going to be happy about. Also, having a forward operating base in such a large area like Chasiv Yar that's so close to the city itself, it really does help the Russians logistically, because you see there aren't really any other major population centers between Kromove and the Canal District. And then you also look at these defenses that the Ukrainians built just east of the Donbass Canal, and now they've been abandoned because they can't be held after the Russians took over the nearby apartments and heights. And so now all those defenses that the Ukrainians built up over the months and years, they have now gone to waste and could actually be taken over by the Russians. And now you also have these various crossings across the canal, like over here into Koshohovo Street, that lead directly into the city. Now, you can't really expect anytime soon a massive advance through a direct route like that, but you could begin to see the Russians sending in DRG squads and trying to undermine any sort of defensive actions that the Ukrainians are trying to take. And that could also happen around Kalinina. I would be really keen to focus on that area as well, and also focus on the area north of Kalinina, because it also connected to the Chasiv Yar area, because the northern flank of Chasiv Yar is just as important in order to try to not just attack head-on, which could be extremely dangerous, and so also look at the river or canal crossings, I should say, over there. And lastly, looking at the Luhansk front, we just do have a slight change with the Russians continuing to advance around Makiivka. It appears they've been able to spot a Ukrainian weak point over here, and that is dangerous because the Zharabets River is very narrow here, and so the Ukrainians do have to maintain control over the crossing past the river, or apparently it's been destroyed from what it's seen over here, but any sort of other crossings around the river have to be made into choke points, prevent the Russians from crossing over, because that could have larger implications for the Ukrainian positions further south. But just looking at what we do know now, because it is still in, I guess, a nascent stage, maybe we'll say that way, I don't know. The Russians were able to advance 2 kilometers over the past 2 days and reach this road that's basically running parallel to the Zharabets River, and cut off that road from the Ukrainian side and reach all the way to the river, reach some of the nearby houses, split the residential part of Makiivka from some of the warehouses to the south as well. And at the same time, it was accompanied by a vector of advance that also cut off that same road over here and reached the Zharabets River, and also took over some residential areas that are part of the village. And so now you have a lot of this gray zone located in the eastern part of Makiivka. And so that is undermining the Ukrainian defense, which is now mainly composed of fighters that are located west of said river. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.